So, you know that Kristin is a historian. She is a very astute cultural critic. She's a best-selling author. And in the tradition of John Lewis, she's a good troublemaker, right? Nick is one of the foremost philosophers in the world and is emeritus professor of philosophical theology from Yale University. He's also a best-selling author. But here's a little bit of trivia about these two. They both attend the same church, and they live not even maybe a mile away from each other here in Grand Rapids. But here's what a lot of folks may not know about them. The two of you were raised in places not very far away from each other in the rural heart of America. So I think it would be fun if you just talk about the places where each of you grew up, and also include in that about your faith upbringing, and how you've ended up theologically where you are today. So I think I'm going to have you start,
I have to
Kristin.
go chronologically.
Your name comes first in the alphabet.
Okay, I guess I will start. I was born in Sioux Center, Iowa. No tears, like.
Yeah, let's hear
Come on. Grew up in the Christian Reformed Church. Went to Dort College. There we go. And it's funny because I end up writing a book on evangelicals, and so I get asked the question all the time: Are you an evangelical? And there's no short answer to that, but the longer answer is like, not really. Like at best, like on the very outer edges, right? I grew up Christian Reformed. My mom immigrated from the Netherlands as a child in a small town, not part of the evangelical mainstream by any stretch, although I did listen to Amy Grant. So, in but not of, I don't know, evangelical adjacent, perhaps. But I just grew up really immersed in the Reformed tradition. My dad was a theology professor at Dort. We took our theology very seriously in my home. And it was really a faith that I came to embrace, particularly, I think, in college. At Dort, taking courses on Calvin's Institutes, and really being immersed. This was in the 90s, in the teachings about shalom. We had some Doyweirdians at Dort. This is something I can say in this audience, but the nice kind of Doyweirdians.
That's going over the head of a lot of people.
Apologies to everybody on the live stream now. But it was just a faith that I came into as my own. And I think is there anything else? I think
That's
that gets
great.
us where we'll pick that up, I'm sure.
Yeah. Nick, you grew up listening to Amy Grant also, I'm sure.
So I grew up the sound is okay?
Yeah.
I grew up in a tiny southwest Minnesota village, Bigelow, a quarter of a mile from the Iowa border. Anybody here ever been in Bigelow?
I have.
Oh my gosh, look at that, look at that.
I have to go there. Right?
You just drive right there.
And when I was 12, we moved to the much bigger village of Edgerton. So growing up in Bigelow, it was in those days a transplant of the Dutch Reformed tradition. There were 2 services on Sunday, and the second service was still in Dutch. The Heidelberg Catechism, coming from the Swiss Reform, was a regular subject of the preaching. So it was a religion that was highly communitarian and familial. It was not at all individualistic. And as Jeff and I were talking in advance, my father was a woodworker. His father, coming from Utrecht, my grandfather, was also a woodworker. So I was reared in the tradition of craftsmanship, and my father also did pen and ink drawings. So some of you know that one of my interests has been aesthetics, and that comes from my father. Then I went to Calvin College, and that was for me revelatory. I was introduced to a different part of the Reformed tradition from the classical confessional 16th century tradition, namely Neo-Calvinism. As I said, it was revelatory. A common view of religion among sociologists is that religion is an add-on. We all have certain views, and then religious people, for some odd reason, add on views about the transcendent, about God, and about the soul, about the afterlife, and so forth. The Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor discusses this at great length, I mean really great length, in Sources of the Self. Neo-Calvinism had the opposite view. Religion was not an add-on, or at least it should not be. One's Christianity should not be an add-on. The idea was that everybody has a world and life view. Excuse me. Every human being is an interpreter. Every human being is a hermeneutic creature. Nobody just drinks in reality, we interpret it. The secular humanist has a worldview, and the secular materialist does, and so do Christians. And so the idea was, work out your worldview in the sphere of philosophy and sociology and medicine and whatever. And that view has remained with me and stood me in good stead. Furthermore, we were taught to engage culture. There are some views of Christianity which subscribe to worldview, but they're isolationist. We were taught to engage culture, engage society and culture. And there was no index. There was no index for forbidden books. We could read anything, provided one interpreted it in Christian terms. So for me, it was capacious. I know that for a lot of people, it was restrictive, inhibiting. But for me, it was a capacious way of being weird.
Okay. So kind of a buzzword right now is deconstruction. And I want to ask each of you here, having heard what you just said, have either of you deconstructed?
No. I mean, deconstruction, it's a term that's defined in a lot of ways, but I certainly don't identify myself as a deconstructionist. I haven't been taking things apart, although there's evolution, there's change, there is setting some things aside, understanding some things more deeply, right? There's growth in any spiritual life. And I do mean that in any spiritual life. As a historian of religion, one of my favorite things to do is read biographies of religious figures, and there is so much change over time in any one person's life, right? This is not static. A living faith is not a static faith. But I have not identified as a deconstructionist because I think I'm still living in the faith in which I was raised. And it was exactly as Nick described. It was a capacious faith. It was one that was oriented towards shalom and human flourishing. It was one, and again, I went to Dort, right, Northwest Iowa. This was my my place, and the faith that I imbibed there was one that was justice oriented. It was one that was expansive, and it was one that was filled with joy and beauty and wonder. And it did apply to all of life. And it was also one that was rigorously rooted in intellectual life, and that suited me very well. And I found when I kind of left that space and went out into the wider Christian world, that was really something that I brought with me from my Reformed tradition, that kind of intellectual understanding of my faith, a deep rootedness in Reformed theology that, again, kind of situated me both in terms of an orientation towards the common good and to the flourishing of all, and again, this capaciousness. So I insist that I'm still walking in the tradition in which I was raised.
Do I need to ask you if you've deconstructed?
I was never tempted to deconstruct, to undercut, to take apart my Christian faith. Even though we'll get to this later, even after the accidental mountain climbing death of our son Eric. When I look at the world, the cosmos, I am simply in awe of its intricacy and its immensity. I'm in awe of the phenomenon of human consciousness, in awe of the fact that human beings can engage in abstract reasoning like mathematics without any particular pragmatic utility. I'm in awe of the fact that there is morality, not just things we like and don't like, but things we ought not to do and things we ought to do. So, for me, God is unshakable. There's no other accounting for this phenomenal world in which we lived, and indeed for the very fact of the world. What we know now about the Big Bang is there's always been existence, somehow. And when you reflect on the phenomena I've talked about, that existence has to be God-like, God. So deconstruction. Oh, let me say one more thing, Jeff. So when I went to Harvard grad school in the early 50s, there was a philosophical movement called logical positivism, which was all the rage. Everybody was talking about it. You don't want me to give you a lecture on logical positivism now. But part of what they said was theological and religious talk is meaningless. It's not false. It's just got no meaning. The only things that have meaning are things that describe the world. I know quite a few Christians who were colleagues who were deeply disturbed by this. But it was clear to me that there was a worldview behind it, and the worldview was science is the road to the future. I didn't believe it for a minute. So my rearing in that part of the neo-Calvinist tradition was a jewel for me when I went to grad school.
It's a beautiful answer, isn't it? Do you want to preach on Sunday mornings? I would love that. I'd come to your church. So, Kristin, I first met you in October of 2016. We were both on the board of Perspectives Journal, which is now the Reformed Journal. It was about 2 weeks before the presidential election between Hillary Clinton and he who shall not be named. And you were well, I don't know if you were excited as much as in terror, but you were telling us that you had a book
I was working on a
that
book.
you were working on. And that book was not Jesus and John Wayne. So what happened? Because the book that came out was Jesus and John Wayne. What happened? Sent you in a different
True
direction?
confessions.
Yes. First of all, yes, we go way back. I was on the board of the Reformed Journal, which, by the way, I was so honored to be asked, right? Because in terms of my faith formation, and the articles that would come my way as an undergraduate and then as a young professor, they were coming from two places, from Reformed Journal and ICS. And I think we'll talk about ICS in a little bit, but these are my people. And so when I was asked to be on the board, it was an immediate yes. And I got to know a bunch of wonderful folks. And I also want to give a quick shout out to John Huang, who is no longer with us. He passed away last year, but several people here may remember him. And he came into the Reformed Journal space around that time. And he was also just a true believer in this kind of Reformed tradition, not the Theobro kind of Reformed tradition. And it frustrated him to no end that when the outside world heard the word Reformed, they thought John Piper. They thought the Gospel Coalition. They thought, he's like, that's not what they should be thinking. So he came alongside and was trying to get us to actually speak publicly about the riches of this tradition. And he prodded us. And I went back and forth. It took him 3 years to convince me to let him make me a website. He kept pushing me out there, pushing in all of us. He was doing that. So where I am now in terms of public scholarship, that really started with John Huang all those years ago, working with us on the Reformed Journal. And he did it because he loved this tradition. And so just that came to mind. But yes, October 2016, I was writing a book on Hillary Clinton. And it was supposed to be initially just a book on her faith formation. I was fascinated. My first book was on progressive Methodist women in the early 20th century. And so she clearly stood in that tradition. And I wanted to write about her faith formation as a young girl and as a young woman. And then somewhere along the way, in the years I was researching that, she decided to run for president, and it looked like she was going to win. And I was kind of terrified at that point because I was suddenly writing. First of all, I was in the news. I was on the news. I was doing all this public stuff far beyond what I had ever dreamed of or wanted to do. And John Huang was thrilled at the time. But also, it looked like I was going to be writing a presidential biography, which was terrifying. And that didn't happen, the presidential part. But something else happened in October 2016. And that must have been about the week before. I have to look at the calendar, our board meeting. But and that was the Access Hollywood tapes released. And I had been watching evangelicals extremely closely for more than a year politically, because I was watching how they didn't appreciate Hillary Clinton, the subject of my study. So I was watching them as early as 2015, August 2015. We saw the first surveys showing white evangelicals backing Trump. And so I'd been watching that extremely closely. And when that Access Hollywood tape released, and the question of the hour was, how could white evangelicals betray their values to vote for somebody like Donald Trump? I knew that wasn't the right question to ask. I had a decade earlier started another research project on evangelical masculinity and militarism. And even though I'd set that aside, I watched as one after another of the preachers, the pastors that I had been tracking became implicated in abuse, in sex abuse, in abuse of power, either directly as perpetrators or indirectly at defending their friends who were perpetrators. And I'd watched those patterns emerge and so consistent. And so in the wake of the release of those tapes, right, for a moment, everybody stopped. Like the world kind of stopped. Like, what's going to happen? It was clear that white evangelicals were his absolutely kind of stalwart base. But everybody's like, surely this is going to be a bridge too far, right? They cannot support this man who goes on record admitting to assaulting women. And so we watched, and sure enough, a couple of evangelical supporters ever so briefly wavered. I think it was Wayne Grudem who withdrew his support, but then he prayed about it, and by the end of the week, he was back again. And then we all know what happened, 3-4 weeks later with the election. And that's when I actually dusted off some of this old research that I had presented papers on evangelical masculinity and militarism. And I just published that times the inauguration to say, actually, this makes sense, right? This is not a betrayal of values. We just don't fully understand what those values are. And that's the backstory to Jesus and John Wayne. My agent at that point had said, we have to, we'll get back to the Hillary book, but let's do this one first. And that's the story.
Yeah. Wow. So, Nick, you've had a long history with the Reformed Journal also, and we figured this out the other day. Tell them when you first published an article in the Reformed Journal.
October 1960.
I'll let you do the math on that. How old were you?
Oh, I'll let them do the math.
Oh, you tell us. You told me you were 28.
I was.
Yeah. I was 2. I think Kristin's parents were in elementary school probably at that time. So, but I, even though you've had that long involvement, I first met you a few years ago when I interviewed you for my book, Telling Stories in the Dark.
Yep.
And my interest in interviewing you was because you'd written meaningfully about your experience with loss and grief in this book, Lament for a Son, which is a tremendous book. And we're not here to plug books tonight, but this is a great book. And while I'm not plugging books also, I will mention that there's a chapter in this book, Telling Stories in the Dark, about Nick, and this book is conveniently available in the lobby right there. And while I'm not plugging books, this is Nick's latest book called Living with Grief, which is further more on the topic. So that's the commercial. But my question is a little complicated based on that. You've written books on subjects like you mentioned, art and aesthetics, and on justice, and you throw around words like ontology and epistemology with ease, while mere mortals look at dictionaries to figure out what those things are about. You're a philosopher and a theologian, and as such, you seek understanding. You want answers. You want to figure things out. But your personal experiences with grief has left you with many unanswerable questions. So I want to ask you about living in tension with unanswerable questions, because so much of what seems to be happening and driving our present moment, especially in the church, is based on certainty and the drive for certainty. So could you speak to the place? This is just the question. Don't applaud the question. Speak to the place of uncertainty.
So Eric's death in the mountain climbing accident when he was 25 did not cause me to deconstruct my faith, but it changed it. In retrospect, the God I'd worshipped before was domesticated, housebroken, comfortable. Things changed. About the time that Eric died, the Surgeon General of the U.S., Everett Koch, wrote a little book about the death of his son, also in a mountain climbing accident.
Yeah.
And what he wrote was, God jiggled the mountain. God jiggled the mountain. I found this unspeakably repulsive. When I read Scripture, God wants us to flourish until full of years. God doesn't just jiggle mountains to kill young men. So after Eric's death, what happened to me in my reading of Scripture was that a theme which I should have noticed before in the New Testament leaped out. That there are in the world what Paul calls powers and principalities. That some kind of strange powers are at work in reality, resisting God's work. So it's not just natural law and human will, but powers. And the biblical language about this is that that these powers are God's enemy. God seeks to defeat them. So for me, the question became different from what had been before. Why does it take so long? Why does God not just snap God's fingers and defeat these powers? Parenthetically, I wonder whether we're dealing with these powers in American politics today. So I have come to live with uncertainty, but I find I can do that because, as I say, I'm gripped by the awesomeness of God's creation. I cannot give up the conviction that there is God, and that God is ultimately a loving God. So I live with uncertainty, and I've come to think, Jeff, that whereas I guess I used to think that Christianity was all about answers to questions, I now think that it's also got to do with what questions we ask. To be a Christian is to ask certain kinds of questions, and of course, to accept certain answers as well. So I can live with that uncertainty. And philosophers try to explain evil. They give theodicies. For reasons I don't understand, I cannot read them. I cannot read them. What jumps to my mind is Eric. Yes, Eric. So don't tell me it's all for the good.
Beautiful. That's a great answer. Isn't it? Wonderful. I want to ask one more kind of background question before we get into a little more meat here, and that is just about, we've touched on both of your long involvement with the Reformed Journal, but would each of you talk about the Institute for Christian Studies and your involvement with?
I didn't
with
quite
that?
get that, Jeff.
With the ICS, with the Institute
yeah.
for Christian Studies.
Yeah. Okay. So I first encountered the ICS through faculty there, through their writings when I was at Dort. I just started to notice that some of the essays I'd be assigned in classes that most grabbed me were all coming from the ICS at the time. As a Christian, as somebody who, as a young person, took my faith really seriously and was all in on the integration of faith and learning, right? I was, that's what I was there to do. And the essays that did that in ways that didn't seem perfunctory, that opened up new ways of thinking, that gave me new questions to ask, those were coming from faculty at the ICS. And my favorite professors at Dort at the time, most of them had ties to the ICS. And people like John Vanderstelt, to ask, those were coming from faculty at the ICS. And my favorite professors at Dort at the time, most of them had ties to the ICS. And people like John Vanderstelt, that name probably means something to some folks here, and John Koch, and Charlie Adams, and in philosophy and theology classes. I took a class in engineering with Charlie Adams, and this all of life idea, and an all of life being brought into in pursuit of goodness, of flourishing, of shalom. I thought that was beautiful. I thought it was rich. And those were the essays that really shaped me in formative ways. And so much so that when it came time to head off to graduate school, I did seriously consider going to ICS. I ended up at Notre Dame instead. And I kind of just went off in a maybe a different direction, except not entirely. I ended up then at Calvin. This is my 20th year at Calvin University, and back in the Reformed space, I could continue in this direction and continue in that project of integration. And as a professionally trained historian, and as a historian who had studied with an eminent Christian scholar, George Marsden, right? So I was very much still in that world. But then it wasn't until I got an email several years ago from a former Dort prof, John Koch. at the time, asking me if I would consider serving on the academic senate of ICS. And John had retired from Dort at the time, I believe, but he was, I think, chairing Senate. And ICS is a smaller institution, but what they do is they invite some outside scholars to also serve on their Senate and to help guide the curriculum and so on. And so I was really honored at that point to be kind of brought back into that space because it had been so formative to me, but I didn't say yes, not right away, because this was now in 2019, I believe, or very early 2020. And so I told John Koch that I would be very honored to do that, but I needed him to kind of take it back to the administration and the board to double check that they really wanted me, because I had a book that was going to be coming out soon. And it might be a little bit provocative, a little bit controversial, and I didn't want to burden the institution with that. And so they needed to really think it over and make sure they wanted that. And the response I got was, Kristin, we know exactly what you do, and that's why we want you. And it was immediate, and that's when I knew that these were my people. This is where I belonged, and so I had the honor to serve on the academic senate for a couple of years, and I've really stayed in their orbit ever since. I was just out there last spring speaking at a wonderful event there, and we've just stayed connected ever since. Oh, wait, one other thing I wanted to say too on that front. When I was saying the most kind of influential thinkers back when I was an undergrad were coming out of ICS, I wanted to name one in particular, and that is Calvin Searfeld, because in fact, I've been thinking a lot about his work more recently, because I'm writing a next book, and it's called Live, Laugh, Love. And I have a chapter in there where I deal with many things, but one of the things that I'm dealing with is precious moments figurines. And I remembered this incredible, I thought it talk that he gave. He came to Dort and gave this talk, and I remembered it. It stuck with me for 30 years, and I couldn't track it down. I remember, I think I reached out to folks at ICS at the time. This was a couple of years ago. Could not track down the exact, did he publish this? Where could I find this? And then just a few weeks ago, I was cleaning my basement, and I came across a stash of old folders from college. One was like a trapper keeper kind of thing. And I opened it up, and there was a page of notes, detailed notes from that talk on precious moments from Calvin Searfeld. And so there is now a footnote in my next book citing that and his analysis of kitsch and beauty and truth, and how aesthetics shape people, not just emotionally, but also politically. So anyway, very formative in many different ways.
Wow. I said the other night in your presence that art will break your heart and kitsch will make you rich. You can think about that. How about you, Nick?
Yeah, my contact with ICS goes back to its very beginnings. I knew probably all of the initial faculty in the 60s. Taught a January course there at least twice with Hank Hart, maybe 3 times. Served on the board for 2 terms. Attended lots of conferences. So I've been interacting with ICS since the mid-60s.
Great. So let's get to this is the big question I've been waiting to ask. This is the one I'm really excited about. The temptation, I think, for many of us is to compartmentalize things and to think, well, we have this religious life and we have this political life. And I don't think that's really healthy. And separating the sacred from the secular. And it seems to me the same forces that have propelled Donald Trump to the presidency twice are kind of running amok in the Christian church right now and doing a lot of damage. And I want to ask, I don't want to use the words that are actually in my head right now because this is going out a lot of places. Something was coming to my mind, but what's up with that? What help me? What in the world is going on here? And you mentioned that white evangelicals continue to be the support base for Donald Trump. So help us with that.
And it's not just white evangelicals. It's also, if you look at white mainliners and white Catholics, also you're looking at some really strong numbers there too. But so we can just say white Christians. What is up? You said about this separating the sacred and the secular, and kind of religious and political. But right now what we're having is almost the conflation of the two. And in a way that does damage to both, I think. The kind of redefining what is Christian, what is moral, in terms of what aligns with a particular political party, and not even a party so much as an individual. Who is arguably not an exemplary Christian by most standards.
But he's up for Pope.
He's up for Pope.
So
right. But I think, one of the things that I came to see in my research was, and it kind of came slowly, looking at historical documents from the 60s and the 70s, and I just saw how frequently the concept of authority came up. Authority, over and over again. How you raise your kids, how a wife needs to submit to her husband. This hierarchical authority over other people was the essence of this faith. Another way of saying this, power over other people. And I saw this link up between family structures, social structures, racial structures, and political structures. And once you kind of conflate Christianity with this quest for power, it utterly corrupts Christianity itself. Because if you look at the Gospels, and here I should add, I feel sheepish talking any theology in front of even just the people in this room, because there are dozens here I know who could do this more expertly, and then let alone all of those on live stream. So this is amateur theologian here, but it Reformed tradition, so we can do that. Jesus, right? He models a spiritual power that looks nothing like earthly power. Right? Over and over again, he messes with his disciples who expect one thing and they're called to something else, which is a much harder path, right? Called to die, called to sacrifice, called to suffer. And that is the Christ that we are to follow. And the scriptures tell us that the fruit of the Spirit, right? If the Spirit is in you, what is that going to look like? Right? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. Super sissy stuff. Right? I mean, if you are listening to this rhetoric of power and masculinity and what it takes to lead, and this is all part of a system where enemies are everywhere, and it's us against them. And if anybody's not 100% on your side, they are your enemy. And therefore, you need to act aggressively, preemptively, right? There's this whole worldview that revolves around this misconception of power and who the church is called to be, who Christ is, and what it means to follow Christ. And so to me, I think that is a fundamental problem. And when you look at anything in the news and you look at the rhetoric and you look at, this task force on anti-Christian bias and all of these things, like what understanding of power is underneath all of that? And I think it is extremely dangerous, harmful, and anti-Christian.
Right at you.
That's a great answer. Thank you. You are a professional. She said she's an amateur. What would you add?
He's the historian, and I'm only a philosopher.
Only a philosopher.
So what was your question? What's up?
Yeah, my question was, what's up?
I don't know. But I'll talk anyway.
Yeah. Spoken like a true philosopher.
So as I read the situation, and for the first half of the 20th century, white American evangelicals avoided politics. Christianity was about getting to heaven. I shall never forget a conversation I had at University of Virginia with somebody who grew up in the South, and he said he grew up with the attitude, Christianity is about getting to heaven. And I said, Chad, that can't be, you can't have grown up. He said, yeah. Politics was dirty business. And what I discovered is that evangelicals had a vague memory of the social gospel of the first half of the 20th century, which was politically oriented and viewed that as liberal Christianity. Then, as I read the situation, Jerry Falwell, with the moral majority, really changed things. I mean, he said, so now we have this intermingling, this intimate intermingling of Christianity and white evangelical Christianity and conservative politics. So what's going on? So when I do my best to understand MAGA Republicans, what comes to my ears, I'm willing to be corrected, what comes to my ears is grievance, a politics of grievance. Grievance against Europe because they aren't carrying their weight. Grievance against all kinds of countries because we've got a negative trade balance with them. Grievance with the bureaucracy because it's loaded with radical leftists. Grievance of all sorts. And white Christians add to this that the grievance of they feel that they're being persecuted, that they're under threat. So a deep politics of grievance in all kinds of directions and retribution, getting even with the judges, the prosecutors, the attorneys, and so forth. And what is it, 80% of white evangelicals voted for this? So why are they into the politics of grievance? Evidently, they feel that something important has slipped away, that an erstwhile situation in which the country was basically Christian. There was almost no abortion. There were no same-sex marriages. The Chinese were not taking away our jobs. The blacks knew their place. That seems to be the situation, as I understand it. But that just raises the question, why do Christians in such, if I'm right, in such large measures embrace this politics of grievance? As you were saying, nobody would argue that this is Christ-like. At least I don't hear anybody arguing that it's Christ-like. Grievance in the Gospels? No. So what's going on? I think what's going on is deep grievance. But why? I don't know.
Well, I want to keep on that for a second and say, can you give us a vision? What do you believe the role of government is? And what do you believe the church's relationship to government is?
So now let me make the switch, and here's where my neo-Calvinism comes out, my lifelong neo-Calvinism. So Kuyper and his followers held that the basic task of government is justice. Now, I've got to say something immediately. There are two fundamental kinds of justice. One is first-order justice, excuse me, and the other is second-order justice. First-order justice is justice in our ordinary relations with each other, teachers with students, and businesses with clients, and so forth. Second-order justice becomes relevant when there's been a breakdown in the first-order justice, and it consists of reprimands, fines, punishments, and so forth. I've talked often about justice. What I've often discovered is that Christians, when they hear the word justice, lots of Christians, let me not overgeneralize, when they hear the word justice, think of second-order justice. They think of prisons, and so forth. We can't understand Scripture unless we understand that deep in the biblical message, when it speaks about justice, it speaks about second-order justice, but mainly primary justice. When it says that God loves justice, it doesn't mean that God loves punishing people. God loves it when we treat each other justly. So the basic task of government is justice. It can do other things, things that serve the common good, infrastructure, and so forth, but then it has to act justly. So that's the basic, as I see it, the biblical and neo-Calvinist understanding of justice. There's a fine book called Republican Theology by Benjamin Leinard, L-Y-N-E-R-D. And Leinard goes through the most prominent evangelical leaders of the last century, talking about their political attitudes. And what all of them say is the task of government is to secure individual liberty. In the entire book, there's hardly a word, the word justice scarcely occurs. Look, liberty is important. The most fundamental right is the right to worship God as we see fit. But liberty in the absence of justice is liberty for the lions and the eagles of the world to do their thing. So the basic task of government is justice. That's, for me, the two fundamental, a lot of biblical texts, but the big ones are Psalm 72 about the good king, and the good king secures justice, and then Romans 13, where Paul says to secure justice and honor the authorities. What I hear nowadays is demeaning the authorities. Paul says honor the authorities. They have a God-given task.
So, quick question. We're at the 100-day mark of the Trump presidency. What are you most concerned about?
Quick question.
Quick, just one thing.
Just one thing. I would say, somebody who paid very close attention to what folks in this administration said they were going to do. There's not a lot that's surprising. But what is therefore most concerning to me is the lack of strong response, sustained response, particularly at institutional levels, and particularly among those with great power. What has stunned me and scared me, to be honest, is watching the utter capitulation of so many institutions and powerful individuals who have the power to change things. And what I've seen is, with very few exceptions, those who have the most power in this moment are deciding to protect that power in a very nearsighted way that will not ultimately protect anything, in my opinion. But what that does is it leaves the rest of us to get a little scrappy. And, kind of no one's coming to save us, which is too bad. It would be really nice. And I think people have been waiting for leaders to step up. And I hear from so many people when I speak, just messages from people saying, what can we do? What can we do? And so I think one of the distressing things, to be honest, is a lack of strong leadership, calling people together and showing us what we can do.
We're going to come back to that in a moment.
Yeah, very good answer. Well, let me just mention two things. Well, three things. One is, again, this politics of grievance. Without, so far as I can see, any positive goal. What is the positive goal? Second, that almost all the action on the part of the administration has been by way of executive declarations. I read the other day that there have been only 5 laws passed by Congress, and these are utterly minor. So it's an autocratic regime. And what deeply worries me is the way in which politicians demean each other, speak ill of each other. In 1 Peter 2, the author says, honor everybody. Honor the emperor, but honor everybody. I'm astonished at the degree to which Christians today in politics do not honor each other. They demean each other. Honor everybody.
Great. So in a moment, we're going to take questions from you all. But before we do that, and from online too, but before we do that, we've kind of been laying out, the airing of grievances or whatever. Happy Festivus. For those who know, for those who celebrate. Sorry. So talk about the opportunities. What is free to be faithful, for example? What's that really mean? What are you seeing in front of us now?
Yeah, so we could talk about all the bad things, and we've barely begun to even touch on all of the bad things, obviously. But in part because of the lack of leadership, because we are in an unprecedented moment, I can't help but think this is also a moment of profound opportunity. People are waiting for somebody to show them what they can do. People are seeing the disregard for human life, the cruelty. People are watching how Christianity is being absolutely twisted and weaponized and to do evil. And we believers, and not just in this tradition, we're speaking out of our tradition. This is where we're coming to these questions out of this particular theological community. But more broadly, the Christian tradition, when I travel widely and across denominations and different cultural spaces, and there is a commitment to what is true and good and beautiful, theologically, morally, politically, across this country, across the border, right? That there are so many of us out there. And I think we have an opportunity right now when Rachel Den Hollander is just kind of one of my kind of guiding lights. And if you read Jesus and John Wayne, I consider her words in that book to be the kind of moral center of the entire book. But she says things, or she said before how it's only the absolute darkness around us, right, that just helps us see so clearly what is light. And we hold that, right? We are drawn to it. We are working within traditions going back generations, centuries, and we can draw on that. And it seems to me this is the perfect moment, not just to draw on it individually and even collectively, but also to offer that out to the world at a time when people are wondering what is happening right now. And will it change things? I have no idea. Probably not. I'm a historian. I'm a pessimist. But every once in a while it does. Actually, every once in a while. And do you know what does change things? Like in the once a generation or so, or every couple generations, it's usually a small group of people. But it's a small group of people with a strong moral center. A strong moral center who do not fear what other people are fearing and who are drawn to something that is just and that is beautiful, and holding that out. And that's what can change the course of history.
Great.
Yeah, to add to that, so whether it's possible to be successful, to be elected and have some influence on the national scene without demeaning your opponents, without lying, I don't know. Once upon a time, it was possible. John Danforth from Missouri and a fellow from the Northwest.
Hatfield.
Mark
Yeah.
Hatfield.
But I think it is possible on the local level. So let's not think of politics only on the national level. When I listen to local Grand Rapids politics or read about it, which isn't very well covered in the Grand Rapids press anymore, but the local politicians are not demeaning each other. They're genuinely talking and listening and trying to find common ground. So we are free to be faithful on the local level. On the national level, I don't know.
So we're going to open this up, and the way this is going to happen, I think Hector, do you have the cards for, or they're on the ends of the rows. If there are a question that you want to ask, or you see the QR code in the Slido, you can actually get online and do that. And we're going to have questions that are going to miraculously appear from around the world and from here. You can write a question, send it down the row, or enter it on the Slido. And we'll take a moment for that to happen. And then we'll have some questions magically appear.
Yeah, and folks on the live stream too, fingers crossed, you can also connect to the Slido, and we'll be getting your questions here. If that fails, you can put it into the YouTube live chat, and we will not be able to get to all the questions by any stretch, but we will be reading all of the questions. So we'd love to hear what you'd like to know more about.
Can I ask a question while we're waiting? Is that possible? Picking up on Nick's work of government should be justice, and your interest in biography, and your comment that no powerful leaders are coming to save us. My question is about the Supreme Court. In their confirmation hearings, all the Supreme Court members are asked about their religious backgrounds and how that affects them. How do you see the work of justice and government working its way through the Supreme Court and their own religious demands?
Do you want to repeat that for the people online?
Yeah, so the question that illegally popped up here, but we're filling time, so it's all good, is the role of the Supreme Court in working towards justice and in securing justice in this particular moment. I don't know if you're thinking more in terms of in theory or in practice. But I don't know, Nick, do you want to take a stab at that, the theoretical first, or I don't know?
Well, John is right. I'll do the theory. In theory,
Yeah.
the Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter with respect to the laws and the Constitution. And I think it continues to do a pretty good job of that. I disagree with some of the decisions, some of them. I was talking, when I was at the University of Virginia, talking to a political science professor there. He said, well, too many of the decisions are result-oriented. I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but the justices have a result that they want and assign their assistants to assemble the legal case for that result. I think that's been especially the case with respect to bearing arms. It strikes me as utterly preposterous to say that a militia means that almost anybody can carry a machine gun.
Do you want to say something about the Supreme Court?
Oh, I just saw some of our Slido questions, so got distracted. Yeah, like, ooh.
They want to know what your favorite Amy Grant song is. I saw that question.
So more on the Supreme Court. I'll just kind of add to that, maybe an indirect response, which is, I really the last years and months have had just a growing respect for our Constitution, for our founding documents, for all of the things that went into creating this in the United States, our system of government, but also a respect for the norms that also must accompany, right, what's written in our founding documents. So it's not just the Supreme Court interpreting, but more generally, and I think one of the problems, I don't know that we've even named this, but kind of talking generally around this, the concept of Christian nationalism, which is the idea, among other things, that America was founded as a Christian nation, and therefore some will even go so far as to say the Constitution was directly inspired by God, and so any interpretation of the Constitution can only possibly align with their understanding of God's law, and of course they'll tell you what that is, and then anything that falls short of that is just wrong and has to be defeated. In our democracy, we have a constitution that protects the rights of people that we may not like, that we may not approve of, right? And it protects rights that we may not always personally like. And democracy requires that we be okay with not always getting our way on everything. Right? And I think that's when I read, Christian nationalist ideas, when I read frameworks, it's all or nothing. And we have God on our side, God is on our side, and everything else is evil. And there is no compromise. There is no compromise. And in our system, and there's a purity test. And our system is not built for that. But if you have more than half of a political party and a party that is in power holding to that, our democracy is not made to function through that. So this applies to the Supreme Court. It applies to enforcing the laws. Respecting judges, all of that. And that to me is fundamentally being undermined right now. Right. Sometimes you win some, you lose some, and you don't always get your way. And the Constitution is designed for that. But people are tossing that aside.
So I'm seeing a couple questions that have gotten, so they get votes, and a couple questions that have gotten very similar, number 1 and number 3. Whoop, it just changed. But now it's 2 and 3. Can we lump 2 and 3 together?
Well, just ask a question, Jeff. Just
Yeah.
pick one and ask it.
Well, I'm picking 2 and 3 together.
Go for it.
A relationship. I tried to ask this in some ways. The relationship between what's going on in government, what's happening in this CRC right now. I don't know if you've heard of this.
Do you want to describe it to me?
You're in a church that is disaffiliated right now.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned about American politics now, it's a politics of grievance, and not only that, it's a politics in which politicians, congressmen, don't really listen to the opposition, but simply try to win the vote by whatever means possible, changing the rules and so forth. The U.S. Senate used to call itself the world's greatest deliberative body. Nobody today would say it is a deliberative body, let alone the world's greatest deliberative body. The major assemblies of the Christian Reformed Church until 20, 30 years ago were deliberative bodies. People at synod listened to each other, spoke respectfully. Took a long time, sometimes an agonizingly long time, to reach a decision that everybody could live with. I remember a visitor from Princeton Seminary once, a professor at Princeton, visiting me once when the synod was going on, said he'd like to attend a session of the CRC synod. So we did. And he found it astounding. He said in his denomination, nothing of the sort occurred. 20, 30 years ago, that changed. Recent synods have not been deliberative assemblies. They've been winner take all. Is that because we in the CRC have been influenced by the surrounding culture? We're certainly part of it.
Yeah. Do you want to speak to that or go on to
let's
this?
just keep going through questions. We'll try to
The
get through
top
you.
one there. Can Kristin speak to the overwhelming white Christian women vote for Donald Trump and what role Christian women have in shaping a new narrative, getting involved in politics, running for office, maybe?
So
Don't blame the men all the time. Is what that's what we're.
read my next book.
Okay. I can't wait.
Yeah, the last
When is
chapter.
that coming up?
Thank you for that. I am.
What's up?
That's exactly what my editor was just saying this week. It will be out next year, end of next year. So I will be turning it in by the fall. So I'm trying to write I'm on the second to last chapter, and then the last chapter is the political kind of takeaways of everything. So yes, white Christian women. I mean, every single election we have, all of a sudden, on the other end of things, the pundits discover white women betrayed their interests and voted Republican. And I mean, it's just a ridiculous narrative because it does not appreciate how women and white women perceive their interests, and it does not. Understand the complexities in political affiliation, and it just shows a real narrow-mindedness on what women should be interested in, and lack of understanding of the role that racial identity plays when it intersects with gender, and so on. There's a lot that could be said there, but. If you look at the numbers, white women are very strong. White Christian women strongly voting for Republicans traditionally, and for Trump as well, but slightly less than white Christian men still. So still is a little bit more your fault. So, I mean, what can be done here? I think that certainly you work in your spaces. If you are a white Christian woman, you work in your white Christian women's spaces, but you also connect to other spaces where you're going to learn some things that maybe you haven't learned in your spaces, and you're going to draw some skills and some insight and a better understanding. And there really is not a silver bullet here. But it is, both working in your spaces, and it is also paying attention to people who are different demographics and who can present the needs of fellow citizens, the needs of non-citizens in ways that I think are morally compelling. And what can white Christian women do? I think just you need to speak out, and you can speak into places, and you can work in places that other people can't work as well. And so, implicated certainly, and there are long historical and cultural reasons for that.
Yeah.
And but also opportunities to do hard work in those spaces.
So I want to be mindful of our time. We have a lot of questions. They will be answered all on Kristin's Substack in the coming. This is a lot of fodder for your Substack right here. I do want to move to the "what do we do now" question, and you're going to speak to that, Kristin. And
Let me just
talk
say,
to about
these are really good
that.
questions.
They're great questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we could try to. Well, I mean, that was kind of a joke. However, we will be signing, or ICS Institute for Christian Studies has a Substack that you are all invited to subscribe to, and it is free. And you can then get regular emails every time there's a post, so you don't miss anything, and we're going to give updates. But I think that I will also propose that we may answer at least some of these questions, or at least share some of these questions, and have some ongoing conversations around this, because all of these questions are good, and some of them are very fun, and some of them are very difficult, and almost none of them are short, except I saw a Switchfoot one up there.